the 28th of August, 984, Amstedt, Austria. Elizabeth Fritzl, who had just turned 18, was at home preparing for a vocational exam. That morning, Elizabeth is approached by a man who asks for help. The man said that a door he had purchased for the basement was not lifting into the frame, and he needed Elizabeth's help to lift it. Elizabeth, always eager, agreed to help without hesitation. However, just as the duo was finishing their work, a hand clutching a towel suddenly reached out from behind Elizabeth's back. Elizabeth didn't have time to shout, but just instinctively sucked in her breath and fainted. 18-year-old Elizabeth Fritz. When she woke up, she was greeted by an empty and dark room. Elizabeth was confused. Had she been ... kidnapped? Could it be the man from ... It couldn't be. It could be that the kidnapper had trapped him as well. Elizabeth looked around the room. The door was closed. There were no windows, and the walls around it were painted white. The room was about 30 square meters, with a bed, a sink, simple fridge, and a heating plate for cooking. Elizabeth took a deep breath and instantly smelled a moldy odor that made her subconsciously gag. Just as she was getting scared, there was a sudden squeak from the corner. Surprisingly, there were rats. Elizabeth squealed loudly in fear. As she tried to run away from the rat, she was unexpectedly yanked back by a huge force and fell onto the cot. It was then that she realized that her arms were fastened to the legs of the bed by a chain. There was no doubt that she was being held captive. And this was obviously a well-prepared cell. Is anyone there? Elizabeth shouted like mad. But there was no one in the empty hut except for the rustling of mice. Then Elizabeth gradually realized that the place must be so hidden that no one could have heard her shouts. Elizabeth's parents, until the next day, the 29th of August, only realized that their daughter was missing and rushed to the police. Mr. and Mrs. Fritz. Elizabeth's father's name was Joseph Fritz, and he was a respected man in the area. He was an engineer and a property developer from scratch, with several properties to his name, as well as running a campsite. Joseph was the backbone of the entire family. His wife, Rosemary Fritz, was a housewife, and also helped her husband run the campsite. During their investigation, the police found that Elizabeth's disappearance was very strange. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air, and she had taken neither money nor any identity documents with her. So, the police thought it was probably a kidnapping case. But who is the kidnapper? Why didn't they contact Mr. and Mrs. Fritz for money for so long? Afterwards, the police asked Mr. and Mrs. Fritz if there were any enemies in their family, or people who had problems with their daughter. When the father, Joseph, heard this, he immediately sighed. She ran away from home when she was 15. It was my wife Rosemary who called the police then too. None of her so-called friends are any good. I think some of them are drug addicts, and they've dragged my daughter into some kind of shady cult where she worships Satan. Hearing Joseph say this, the police immediately checked the records. Sure enough, Joseph was telling the truth. Elizabeth Fritz had run away from home at the age of 15 and was returned home from Vienna by the police 3 weeks later. It turned out to be a girl with a history of running away from home. The police looked at the record in their hands and became unimpressed. In Austria, more children run away from home every day than can be counted. What's more, Elizabeth was an adult. So the police persuaded the Fritzes to go back to the house. If it really was a kidnapping, the kidnappers would have called home. Elizabeth, as a teenager. At this point in her life, Elizabeth had no idea what was going on in the outside world. A few hours after her captivity, a man came to the cell. When the door was opened, Elizabeth rushed to her feet. But just as the last door opened, Elizabeth got a good look at the other man, the very man she had helped, and despair made her keep questioning him. How could it be you? Why are you doing this to me? But the other man didn't say a word to her. He just dragged Elizabeth to himself by the chain. Then, he violated her. Listening to Elizabeth's screams of pain, the man's face showed a huge sense of arousal. To him, the feeling was simply overwhelming. And it was from that day on that the man came every day, came and violated her, and then left with his trousers afterwards. Moreover, he never talked to Elizabeth. No matter how much the poor girl begged for mercy, he never spoke. But if Elizabeth dared to resist him, she would get a severe beating in return. Grief-stricken Elizabeth cried all day long. Finally, one day, the man spoke. He brought Elizabeth a pen and paper and said to her in a hoarse voice, "Do as I say and write it down." On the 21st of September, a letter appeared on Elizabeth's doorstep. Translated with DeepL.com free version.